Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 34th meeting of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee for 2024. Our first item of business this morning is a decision on taking item 5 in private. Item 5 is the consideration of the evidence we will have heard on the Land Reform Scotland Bill. Are we content to take this in private? We are. Thank you. The second item of consideration is a draft statutory instrument, the Greenhouse Gas Emissions Trading Scheme Amendment Number 2, Order 2024. The instrument makes various changes to the UK Emissions Trading Scheme. The Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee has made no comment on the instrument in their report, and I welcome Gillian Martin, the Acting Cabinet Secretary for Net Zero and Energy. I also welcome the Scottish Government officials joining us for this item, Marina Cover, who's a Senior Policy Advisor, and Nanjika Nasiro, who is the Head of Just Transition. The instrument's laid under the affirmative procedure, which means that it cannot come into force unless the Parliament approves it. Following this evidence session, the committee will be invited to consider a motion to recommend that the instrument be approved. Just as always, I remind everyone that Scottish Government officials can talk in this part of the debate, but not in the second part of the debate. And I'm going to ask the Cabinet Secretary to make a short opening statement. Cabinet Secretary, good morning, and we listen to your statement.
Good morning, Convener, and to the rest of the committee. I'm pleased to give evidence supporting the draft instrument to amend the Greenhouse Gas Emissions Trading Scheme Order 2020. The Emissions Trading Scheme, or ETS, authority formed by the 4 UK nations is implementing changes to strengthen the ETS's climate ambition. The authority published a response to the Developing the UK ETS consultation in July last year, which included the following commitments being implemented through this instrument. They are amending the cap trajectory so it's better aligned with net zero targets, covering additional emissions in the upstream oil and gas sector, and improving the penalties process, on which we have delivered an additional consultation earlier this year. So if I could turn to the new cap trajectory, in 2023 the authority committed to reduce the ETS cap by 30% by the 1st of January 2024. And this amendment needed approval by the 4 UK legislators, and Northern Ireland did not have a sitting assembly at the time. So the authority used powers reserved to HM Treasury as a temporary measure to amend the number of allowances to be auctioned from 2024. And this ensured that the number of allowances in the market were aligned with the agreed 30% cap reduction, and Ms McCallan sent a letter in July 2023 explaining this decision. Now that Northern Ireland has got a functioning assembly, we are looking to amend the cap through the Climate Change Act, giving the committee the opportunity to scrutinise the new net zero cap aligned trajectory. We're also amending the industry cap, which limits the number of free allocations and creates a flexible share on the back of the changes to the cap trajectory. And I'll now present the other provisions in this instrument. This instrument expands the ETS to cover emissions from CO2 venting in the upstream oil and gas sector. Now, CO2 venting, which is releasing emissions through pipes or vents, wasn't previously included as an ETS-regulated activity. So in contrast, the flaring of CO2, burning the gases before releasing them into the atmosphere, is an ETS-regulated activity. So the inclusion of venting in the ETS aims to remove any perverse incentives for operators to vent gas containing CO2 that flared would be exposed to the ETS carbon price. We're also extending to Northern Ireland legislative changes to be implemented in Scotland, England and Wales during 2023 to ensure that the ETS is consistent across the whole of the UK. And lastly, this instrument will introduce 2 penalties and amend existing penalties to improve consistency, proportionality and fairness of the penalty process. And I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone has, Convener.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. Just looking around the table, Douglas wants to come in.
Thank you, Convener. Just I was going to ask, in terms of the venting, what's that going to mean in practical terms for companies that are operating in the North Sea Basin?
Well, it effectively means that there's not a loophole for getting rid of CO2. At the moment, if you were to flare off any gas, then you would obviously, we have the ETS to cover that. We obviously don't want a situation where there's CO2 being vented into the atmosphere, which is effectively the same kind of effect of actually the flaring activities. So it's closing a loophole. In terms of what effect that will have on operations, well, it means that operations will have to be consistent with not venting CO2. So really, as it's closing a loophole, it's my understanding that this is not exactly a practice that goes on an awful lot, but it's just removing that loophole in case there's as I think I mentioned in my statement, a perverse decision to vent without flaring to avoid the fact that you would actually be impacting your ETS allocations.
And can I ask, in terms of operators just now, are they able to measure this accurately? Is that in place just now? And is it then
so
easy for them
my
to
understanding of the oil and gas industry is that all emissions that they produce is measured. They have to do that by law.
So you wouldn't see this as an extra burden on them?
It wouldn't be an extra burden.
Maybe financially?
It would just be, in fairness to the oil and gas industry, they're actually really working hard to reduce their emissions, their production emissions. So actually this is helpful for them, because those that are actually reducing their production emissions, will be saving money as a result of this.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Commissioner.
Thank you. A few questions lining up. Mark, followed by Kevin.
My understanding is that the Norwegian production of gas is lower carbon than our own production of gas because they have a restriction on venting and flaring. So I'm wondering if that's your understanding of the situation, and if it is, then do these adjustments to the ETS and the overall regime for venting bring us into closer alignment with Norwegian practice and therefore more comparable in terms of emissions?
Well, I don't know much about the Norwegian sector, first of all, but if what you're saying is true, then obviously this instrument will bring us in line with that, because at the moment there is a kind of loophole that your flaring activities would be subject to having to use your ETS allocations in order to make up for that, but not your venting of any CO2. There's also it might not stop here, though. We might be looking at methane emissions as well. That's something that might be happening in the next couple of years. We're actually looking at that as well. So I am not entirely sure whether the Norwegian sector does include methane as well as CO2. It'd be interesting to see if it is something that I will look into after this. But certainly, from what you're saying, if that's the understanding of what the Norwegian sector does is correct, it brings us more in line with them.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Mark. Kevin.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Can you give us an idea of why it was that venting was missed out in the ETS previously, or is that beyond your ken?
It is slightly beyond my ken. I think it's one of those things that, and obviously there was a great emphasis on reducing the amount of flaring that was happening, and
Sure.
that was the real kind of focus of this. That's something that I guess that I would have to look into, why venting was missed out. But this is correcting that, and as I say, closing that loophole so that we don't have effectively CO2 emissions going into the atmosphere that don't need to be vented.
Thank you. I think closing that loophole is grand. It would be interesting to see why that loophole was left in place in the first place. But obviously, that's nothing to do with you, Cabinet Secretary, but to do with others. In terms of some of the debate, some of the questioning that's already taken place this morning, and the suggestion that some other areas have decarbonised to a greater degree than us, can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, is there going to be further moves in terms of ETS to lead to even greater decarbonisation of the oil and gas sector? And what discussions, general discussions, have you had with the UK government around about further decarbonisation of the oil and gas sector? And importantly, what will they put in place in terms of the right fiscal regime to ensure that decarbonisation continues apace?
Well, only a North Easter could ask such an intricate question, and I'm pleased to answer it. So there's a couple of things in there. Obviously, it's our position that there needs to be a fiscal regime in place that means that we have an oil and gas industry that is allowed to support its workforce and is also going to be instrumental in the transition to net zero. Quite a lot of oil and gas producers are also involved in ScotWind licence options as well. They also support a vast supply chain as well. So I think it's a well-rehearsed argument out there that we need to make sure that we don't discourage activity in that area, because if we do, then we'll have a workforce that will relocate to other parts of the world, leaving Scotland without the expertise that it needs, both in supply chain and in the workforce, to actually build out ScotWind and other industries that are going to keep us as an energy-producing nation. In terms of the decarbonisation place, I think that actually Scotland's got a very good story to tell in that, because we have got the INTOG licensing route, which is the first licences that have actually been given through the consenting unit have been for the INTOG scheme, which is about them allowing the build-out of floating offshore wind, largely floating offshore wind, to provide the power to existing oil and gas producing platforms, to allow them in their production processes to use electricity rather than diesel. So that's going to be bringing down the production emissions quite markedly in that area. We're the only part of the UK that has done that, and I think there's quite a lot of lessons that can be learned maybe in other oil and gas producing countries that are looking to decarbonise their production emissions from oil and gas.
Thank you, Convener. Obviously, what has happened with INTOG is fantastic. Can I ask, in terms of that continued dialogue, that continued move forward, do you think that the UK government are actually listening to industry, whether that be oil and gas industry and others, around about what is required in terms of not only a fiscal regime but a regulatory regime that actually allows for greater decarbonisation?
Well, I think I would say yes and no. I say in part they are. Obviously, there was some warnings from the oil and gas regime that there would be a lot of people that would be pulling out of the North Sea sector if certain fiscal penalties were put in place around the tax. So that they didn't come to pass in the budget. But in the other aspect of things, which is the extended producer liability, the EPL, the extension of that has obviously had an impact. We've just seen that, as a result of the EPL, for example, Apache have decided to pull out of the North Sea. Now, these are not new fields; these are existing fields, and we have a situation. I mean, and again, we're going into more of the kind of the energy space here in general. But we have a situation where there's still demand for natural gas in the UK. We're still using it for the majority of heating, and we are still employing 58,000 people associated with oil and gas. So anything that has a precarious drop-off point because of a fiscal regime is problematic, because, as I say, what we need to do is we need to have a just transition where we have oil and gas is obviously reducing. The amount of oil and gas available in the UK continental shelf is reducing. We know that for sure. But we need to have a managed transition. And if we have any cliff edges around production, we're obviously going to have to import more gas from elsewhere in order to meet our demand, but also we're going to provide a cliff edge for workers for whom, ScotWind has not even been built out yet. There are not the jobs yet to actually replace the amount of jobs, but there will be in the future if we manage this transition well. And the fiscal regime around oil and gas is very important in that respect.
Thank you. I have probably many more questions, but go beyond the order, so I better give up there.
I was going to say, Mr. Stewart, I think some of that drifted beyond the boundaries of this SSI, but on that basis, I'm going to move on to Monica.
Thank you. I'm going to be really dull now and just stick to the instrument, because I'm quite keen to cover compliance and enforcement. So the instrument introduces 2 new penalties and changes several existing penalties. So I'm just keen to hear if there's been any assessment of what the regulatory regime would look like around that, and are we expecting breaches to be the exception? Would they be quite a rare occurrence?
I hope so. I guess in terms of the actual regime, it was the same regime that you have now for penalties. If I could go through the penalties, we'd be operating without a permit. It would be under-reporting. You'd be a penalty associated with that. If an operator fails to surrender allowances to cover for their emissions, there will be a deficit penalty. But another important thing is that the penalties are being changed in line with inflation as well. So there will be an increase in the actual value associated with a penalty as well. So there's more incentives for people not to breach any of the rules and incur any penalties. So again, it's tightening up the penalty regime as well. And you would hope that, I mean, there's certainly plenty warning that this ETS is coming into place, but you would hope that there would be very rare, that all those occurrences would be very rare.
Do you have any figures on any non-compliance issues to handle?
I think that I don't have them in front of me, Ms Lennon, but we can certainly ask. They would probably be held centrally at the UK government, but certainly we can look into that for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's helpful that you've explained about the inflationary increase, because when you look at some of the penalties, you know, the part around failure to submit information, a civil penalty of £5,000, you know, for a big operator, they might not notice that. So I was just curious to understand how robust that has been.
Yeah, there's also other things that are happening in order to incentivise decarbonisation as well. There was a reduction in the amount of free allocations that have been given. If you look at aviation, across the UK will have no more free allocations after 2026. And that has been something that has been, you know, trumpeted quite loudly. They're building up to that as well. So some of the larger emitters in this area, and particularly aviation, where there's not really much of a danger of carbon leakage there, they are preparing for the fact that they won't have any free allocations as well. So it's a real tightening up, and it's really aligning ETS with the net zero ambitions of all the 4 nations of the UK in line with the net zero targets.
Okay, that's helpful. So I think that's quite clear that this does tighten things up. Is it, you know, a minor change for regulators in terms of any inspections or proactive work they do? Are we expecting any capacity issues for regulators?
There's none expected.
Nothing
at all.
Okay.
No.
Okay, so it's fairly business as usual then. Okay, thank you.
Mark, you want to come back in?
Yeah, thanks. I know previously there was discussion with the previous UK government about the introduction of a carbon tax. I know that was an option at one point. Now, whether that was intended to run alongside an ETS or as a replacement of an ETS, I'm not sure. But it'd be useful just to get your thoughts on whether a carbon tax is now off the agenda, whether everything is now completely focused on an ETS. And again, I was just looking at Norway. I know that Norway also has an ETS, presumably that's aligned with the EU, but they also have a carbon tax on their oil and gas sector and on the production emissions from the oil and gas. So they have an ETS and a carbon tax, quite a significant contribution that the industry then makes back to the Norwegian state as a result of that. So I'm just interested in where that discussion is, whether carbon tax is off the agenda or on, or whether we're just really looking at this instrument now as the main way to decarbonise.
I'll be up front. In the 3 months that I've been Cabinet Secretary, I have not had any discussions around a carbon tax, and obviously the UK government put out their budget and one was not mentioned as well. But one thing I would say, and obviously we've got the extended producer liability as well, which I would say it actually is you know, a carbon tax on oil and gas industry. But what I would say about that, since you've given me the opportunity, is that any money that is, or funds that are gleaned from having these kind of taxes should be used for net zero activities. I mean, it's my view that if you are putting a tax on emitters, that money should come back to the Treasury and be allocated to net zero efforts. For example, you know, potentially things that would help us, our heating buildings decarbonise, or decarbonisation of the gas grid. All these big, expensive things, I would like to see the tax that's come in from emitters. But again, that's for the UK government to decide, but I haven't had any conversations about a carbon tax. Obviously, there is the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is also going alongside this, and we're working with our UK counterparts, as well as the Treasury, to design that the UK carbon border adjustment mechanism works along the UK ETS at the same time, and means that Scotland's doesn't have any negative impacts and any additional costs on Scotland's exporters as well. We're also still looking at alignment with the EU ETS as well. These are conversations that are still happening around alignment with the EU as well. So there's lots happening in this space, but a carbon tax specifically is not something that I've had a discussion with them about.
Okay.
Thank you. If there's no other questions, I've got a couple. I have to say I listened to that exchange with interest and about carbon taxes being used to fund net zero. It would be remiss of me not to say that that's what ScotWind was going to be doing as well, but it doesn't appear to have been used for that either. But just one of the comments that you made was that when it came to venting, there was very, very little of it going on in Scotland. Well, what are you talking about? What is very little? Can you quantify that? How many companies?
I don't think I did say that, because I don't have the numbers on how much CO2 venting is actually going on in Scotland, convener. So sorry if I misspoke there. I don't actually have the numbers on that. But again, I'm just saying that this instrument here is to, I suppose, put venting of CO2 on the list of actions that would be part of the ETS. Can I just come back on your ScotWind comment? ScotWind was designed for three reasons. It was to decarbonise the electricity that we supply to the whole of Scotland, the UK. It was, four reasons. It was to provide an opportunity for Scotland to have a thriving energy sector. It was to fund net zero work, and it's my wish that it will do so. I'm not going to preempt anything that happens in the budget. And it was also to encourage investment in Scotland, which it's absolutely doing as well. So my comments about anything that is done in terms of funding that's come from big emitters applies to the whole of the UK. That's certainly my view of what should happen, but it's also my view that ScotWind should be addressing those four aspects and aspirations that we have, and I wouldn't want to preempt anything that's said in the budget.
And nor would I, and I'm sure we can have a conversation of how the £750 million that was raised from the option payments has been spent and how much is on net zero. But let's park that. If I could just go back, one of the concerns that I had when I was looking through the briefing, that the trading scheme was suggesting that if the carbon capture usage and storage scheme went ahead, that the actual cost of the trading units would be kept down. Have you made an assessment of what the cost will be if the carbon capture usage and storage doesn't go ahead? I mean, is it going to become very expensive? Because I think what we were seeing is that Scottish businesses have invested a huge amount of money already in this, or have I got that wrong?
So with regards to the ETS, I'm not quite sure I see the correlation in it costing businesses money if carbon capture and storage doesn't go ahead. But since you've mentioned carbon capture and storage not going ahead in Scotland, it gives me the opportunity to say carbon capture, utilisation and storage must go ahead in Scotland. We must get action on getting track status to the ACORN project. The Committee for Climate Change has made it clear on many occasions that we will not reach our net zero 2045 target if carbon capture and storage does not happen in Scotland. We're also missing a massive economic opportunity for Scotland as well, which is maybe more aligned to your question to me.
Well, so, I think, sorry, Cabinet Secretary, just to help you, I think what we were told in our papers is the ETS assessment across the UK would probably cost £2.4 billion to business, and that's assuming the carbon capture, usage and storage scheme and hydrogen goes ahead as delivered. My question to you, if it doesn't, have you made an assessment of actually what it's going to cost businesses in Scotland? I'm sorry if I badly explained.
Now I understand. Obviously, the ability to store carbon and to be involved in a CCUS scheme as a business and be able to have your carbon stored, and we were talking about oil and gas and particularly just there about venting, if you're able to put that to carbon capture and storage, then obviously that is going to reduce the cost of your business, absolutely. And if it's not available to Scotland, if it's not available to the Scottish cluster, if it's not available to all those industries that are in Scotland that want to be part of the Scottish cluster, then that's a very real problem. But the biggest issue for me is the fact that we're missing out on a major opportunity to take carbon out of our processes and atmosphere, but also it puts 2045 on a bit of a sugary nail. And the Committee for Climate Change has said that time and time again. So if I could use this opportunity to say we need track status for the Acorn project as soon as possible.
I was trying to work out what the cost would be to Scottish businesses if that didn't happen as a result.
I don't have a quantified amount, but obviously it'd be difficult to quantify that at the moment. But basically, not having carbon capture and storage available in Scotland will have an impact on emitters.
Okay, if there's no more questions, which there doesn't appear to be, we're going to move on to agenda item 3, which is the... No, it's not. Sorry. Yes. Yes, it is. Sorry, I almost got myself confused there, but I wasn't confused. It's the debate on S6M 14755, calling on the committee to recommend approval of this draft order. Cabinet Secretary, I'd like you to ask you if you'd like to speak to and move the motion.
I'll just move the motion.
Thank you. Are there any contributions that members wish to make? I'm not seeing any. So on the basis there's been no contributions, I'm not entirely convinced you'll need to sum up, Cabinet Secretary, but if you want to, I have to give you the opportunity.
No, I'm happy to leave it as is.
Thank you very much. The question, therefore, is that motion S6M 14755 in the name of Gillian Martin be approved. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are agreed. The committee will need to report on the outcome of this instrument in due course, and I just ask the committee to delegate authority to me as convener to approve the draft of the report for publication. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary, and thank you to your officials. I'll now suspend the meeting briefly to allow a changeover of witnesses. Thank you.